Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech Asian Midday Market Watch. I'm Samantha Voon and it's Monday, the 10th of June. And our guest today is Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank Singapore. Vishnu, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me on. Always good to be here on a Monday.
Great. So let's get into it. Vishnu, the US economy added 272 jobs in May. Those are really strong data. What are your thoughts? And more importantly, what are some underlying weaknesses that we could potentially be missing out here?
Sure. And let's start with what you pointed out, Sam. For sure, the number was strong, exceeded Wall Street's expectations. So the headline, particularly when coupled together with somewhat stronger and a pickup in wage gains, suggests two things. It suggests that the US labor market continues to be strong and hot. And that also means that the Fed cannot quite pull the trigger on a rate cut. So not just at this particular meeting in June, but very likely going into July as well. That's on the surface of it, but someone digging deeper into the data might actually have reason for pause. There are several factors here. One is, if we were to look at the unemployment numbers, however, unemployment actually ticked higher, and that's on the back of an upward revision in previous unemployment. So unemployment went above 4%, and that's despite participation rate falling back. So this does suggest to some degree that the job market may not quite be as hot as the overall numbers suggest. And there's of course, for those data nerds out there who look at the adjustment factors involved, the model used by the BLS to adjust the data might be lagging. It might be over accounting for some of the stronger factors and hence overstating the strength. Whereas once you adjust those factors, plus the fact that more immigration means that more jobs need to be created for all else to be equal. Once we adjust for those, the non-farm payroll numbers may not be as positive as the headline suggests, which then brings us to the conclusion that the US economy could be cooling a lot more than headlines suggest. In fact, contrary to what headlines suggest, and that opens up scope for the Fed to start cutting later this year, and perhaps at a faster pace potentially as well.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you see this Federal Reserve stance impacting the US dollar and the yields in the near term?
But I think in the very near term, markets are quite happy to look at the headlines. I mean, it is quite seductive, so they're going to be seduced by it. And then I think the positioning would be for a hawkish shift at this FOMC meeting. So it's one of those things where the Fed doesn't even have to do anything. They'll come across by default having a bit of a hawkish sway. How this is going to be gauged is so that the bar is going to be higher for this one. How it's going to be gauged is it's going to be gauged on exactly what the Fed says. We bear in mind that the FOMC statements tend to be quite conservative, so you don't expect a huge swing there. Markets will expect those swings to come through in the press conference, particularly to pointed questions around whether the Fed may delay the rate hikes, by how much, whether inflation is sticky. And to these questions, chances are the response is going to come out on a slightly more hawkish side of things, saying that they can afford to wait and watch, so on and so forth. The other aspect is the dot plot, because every quarter revised economic forecasts are released, and I think markets are going to home in on the dot plot, because the so-called dot plot, which is the projection of the various FOMC members on where they see the Fed fund rates by the end of each year. The March dot plot had the FOMC still looking for 3 rate cuts. So bets are really mounting that this time that will be dialed back to 2 or fewer. So markets are going to look at the median number, which is what they focus on in the headline. But beyond that, they're going to dig into the dispersion of that number to see whether the mean tendency is to fewer cuts rather than more cuts. They'd also be particularly interested to see whether there are any more extreme views of maybe no cuts this year. The more you get of those, the more likely it's going to be a bit more of a hawkish tilt, which means US Treasury yields can go higher and the dollar can also go stronger. and that's going to be accentuated by the fact that the ECB, the Bank of Canada, the Swedish Central Bank, and the Swiss National Bank have all started cutting rates, and so the Fed, on a relative standpoint, is going to look more hawkish, even if the direction of travel for rates overall is going to be to the downside. So that's something to think about.
Mhm. So let's turn over to Japan for a bit. So, what do you expect from the Bank of Japan's upcoming policy decision, and how might this impact the Japanese yen?
Well, I think we're expecting that the BOJ was going to be quite cautious. I mean, market expectations might be a little bit more dispersed and differentiated than that. But our sense is that the statements from the various BOJ officials, including Governor Ueda, suggest two things. One is they do concede that there's scope for policy to tighten. But equally, I think they are also saying, look, caution is warranted. We don't want to over tighten, certainly not too soon. Yes, wage increments have been fairly stronger than expected, but they are saying the jury is still out there because on the ground, consumer sentiments are really not that strong, and they are not completely assured that this pace of wage hikes will remain in place. So, on balance, I think we are still tilting towards a position where the BOJ is going to signal they can hike in Q3, but not just yet. They're going to assess. Whereas what they might do is through their so-called Rinban operations, they might start uh, to reduce the pace at which the balance sheet expense. In other words, their bond buying might be scaled back at the margin. So that's the first part, what they might do, which is move very cautiously the needle towards the hawkish end, but not overly so. And here's the tragedy. Despite the Bank of Japan leaning that way, markets might end up discounting them anyway. So they're going to write this off as a hawkish, or rather as a dovish tightening. And that might perversely lead to the Japanese yen remaining weak or even being knocked back further, depending on the Fed outcomes. And I think that would remain the challenge for the BOJ policy, which is to do what's required for the economy, but at the same time stabilize the yen against somewhat more fickle and speculative markets.
Mhm. Okay, so how about the Thai and the Taiwanese central bank meetings? What are your outlook for them?
I mean, simply put, we think both are going to sit on their hands, not do much. And against the backdrop of a Fed that's also, quote unquote, not doing much in terms of action, the irony is that the Thai baht and the Taiwanese dollar could come under some pressure because the Fed would be perceived to be hawkish, whereas if the rhetoric isn't hawkish enough, both the central banks might end up looking not quite measuring up to the Fed. So, on relative terms, that could pressure the Thai baht and the Taiwanese dollar vis-a-vis the US dollar. So that's certainly a risk there. For the Thai baht as well, I mean, that there are specific stress factors for these currencies. For the Thai baht, is the tensions between the government and the central bank, which undermines the currency to some extent. And for the Taiwanese dollar as well, the tensions, the political tensions, and the political risks also weigh on the Taiwanese dollar. So in the very near term, we think even if it's a status quo in terms of policy moves, that does not equate to a static market. The risk factors and the pressures are tilted to the disadvantage of Asian currencies versus the US dollar.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much for your insight, Vishnu. It's always good to hear from you.
Always a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me here, Sam.
Yeah. So we've been speaking to Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank in Singapore, BizTech Asia Midday Market Watch. I'm Samantha Voon. And this video and podcast will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, social media platforms, as well as our syndication partners' TV stations, radio stations, and website. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in.